Welcome back to another live stream. Are Steve and I fighting? Is it on? Is the beef on? Is this going to be like a rap beef? Tupac and Biggie Smalls of the 90s. We're going to go at it today. We're going to talk about reserve banking. Is government spending the exclusive domain of creating reserves? Or is it a domain of the Federal Reserve? It is a liability, after all, on their balance sheet. We're going to talk about that. I've got a new book coming out, maybe late November. We'll touch on that too. Obviously, we got to talk about Charlie Kirk. Stay tuned. It's going to be fun.
You are now relearning economics.
Welcome everybody that's watching live. Make sure you hit the like button, subscribe, hit that notification bell, and make comments underneath the video as well as the live chat. That helps with the algorithm. Let's get right into this. So I put out a tweet maybe 2 or 3 days ago, basically showing the operations of a treasury auction. Now, a treasury auction is a primary auction, basically, where the government issues treasuries. Primary dealers come in and buy them. Now, primary dealers are financial institutions. Now, not all of these primary dealers hold accounts with the Federal Reserve. In fact, only 5 do. And so there was some, talk, maybe one of my other previous posts I had put about, well, the private sector is funding the government. And the truth is, these auctions are settled with reserves, and reserves are entirely created by the Federal Reserve. And if you consider the Federal Reserve a pseudo branch of the U.S. federal government, that kind of points to the fact that the U.S. government is essentially funding itself. And of course, there's deeper detail on this. You can read the thread on my Twitter, or you can go to my Patreon, patreon.com/relearningeconomics, and read an article I posted that goes a little more in depth. It's paid right now behind a paywall, but eventually I'll put it out for free. It gets some nuance behind it. Now, Steve came in. Of course, now all my haters come in. I get a ton of them now. In fact, the book that I was talking about in the intro was really inspired by all the hate I get on Twitter X. It's quite phenomenal. Literally, I counted out of all my replies in the last 13 months, which came to about 42,000 replies. At least 20,000 of them were arguing about, historical quotes, blah, blah, blah. But anyway, so there's a bunch of those people. So I generally ignore them, but then I see Steve Geen. He comes in and he says, "Oh, wait, mate. Reserves are created by government spending." And I said, "What? Pardon me?" Well, I didn't quite say that. I actually said I technically agree. That is one of the forms of reserve money creation. But it's not all of the story, and there's more to it. So we're going to dig into that. That's going to be our primary story. Let's bring in Daniel. Daniel Sanderson. Let's bring in Daniel. How you doing, Daniel? I can't hear Daniel. Oh, maybe, hold on, Daniel. There we go.
I said, pardon?
Now, do you remember it was Captain Amazing? He was on the radio. I said, "Pardon me?" I said, "Your wife's got a nice rack." I said, "What?" I snapped. I lost it. I went crazy. Do you remember him on the radio?
Yeah.
Now, I don't know if that's a North American wide thing, but it was here, I think, on 99.3 The Fox in Vancouver. Yeah. But that's exactly who I was thinking about when I did that. But anyways, how you doing, Daniel?
I feel you, bud. I feel you. I'm doing good. I feel really good.
Good. Glad you showed up today.
Yeah. Well, when I arrive, I always show up. You know what I'm saying?
Well, yeah, I know. That's deep. That's deep. I'm gonna have to think about that. I'm gonna bring on Dave next. I think about that deep statement you just made, Dave. How you doing, buddy?
I'm good, thanks, Daniel. Good to see you, man.
Yeah, you too.
You blink, but he's bringing the philosophy, obviously. Ty, he's got it. He's going to get deep straight away. There's no point in waiting for it. And what's this? So what's going on? There's this internecine, like infighting has started already on this channel. It's like, it's been broad agreement, and now you've just like you're splitting with Steve Keen. Is that it? Is that what's going on?
It's over. Our bromance is over after 4 years. I
It had to happen.
lost. I said what? Pardon me.
Or maybe you just through the honeymoon period, and now down to the real hard graft
we're
of
having
marriage.
It's a domestic dispute, and we're going to do therapy in the public eye, just like if we're going on Dr. Phil or the Oprah show, and we're going to settle it the old-fashioned way by exploding our souls to the world.
I understand.
Yes. Let's bring on. Oh, Dave, you're doing well, I hope.
Yeah, I'm having a great week. Mind you, it's a very English thing to talk about the weather, but it's gone from, it's really freaking hot to, by the way, it's winter now in a week. It's ridiculous. So, we've gone from drought to near flooding. So, that's how my week's feeling. But I'm okay. That's just England for you.
Yeah, that's and the west coast of Canada. Daniel can attest to this. Is England, baby England, when it comes to the rain in the winter, especially right down on the coast. It's the same climate, so I feel you. We're still warm here. It's actually perfect temperatures going on for the last week. 20s. Still got some sun, but today it is a little bit cloudy. So. It is what it is.
Well,
we'll bring on Mike.
Let's not dwell on the weather. Let's bring in some. Yeah.
Hey, fellas.
Cool.
How you doing, Mike?
Mike's having a totally different week. Mike, come on. We got to talk about welding.
Oh yeah, I'm relearning welding. I used to weld 50 years ago. I forgot a lot about how to do it, so I'm taking a class. And lots of fun.
I'm learning Premiere Pro or a new NLE timeline, which is really boring. Mike's welding. I feel inadequate. And
we all have our interests.
I feel like he's I gotta trademark this name, Relearning Economics, because you're treading pretty close to taking my moniker there. With relearning welding. Now I used to do so my friend let me use his welder once, and it was a little tack welding. He tried to get me to tack weld something, and it was a mess. It was like a 3-year-old kid with a pack of crayons drawing on a blank piece of paper. It was a disaster. So, and I once did light an acetylene torch, and I looked at it and I'm like, yeah, okay, this is as far as I go. But now that I've seen the former PM of Australia attempt to weld, I feel like I've done enough, and I don't want to be in the position that he was in. I did wear my mask, by the way, so there's that. Let's bring on Professor Steve Keen, my new enemy.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, right, okay. You can call you're wearing green, so you can be the Incredible Hulk. Okay. Okay. I'll be Thor. I've got the hammer.
Okay. Yeah.
It's unfortunate that you guys aren't in the same room, because then you could do a version of the Jerry Springer show for economics.
I've got to get the soundboard going, because this is where we'd have the chant, Jerry, Jerry.
Throw chairs at one another and.
Yeah. I feel like it's been more like the Spy Who Shagged Me with Dr. Evil and his son.
That's a bit closer to it, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's what it'd be more
he's
like.
He's Mini-Me. Actually, I can get away with that. So, he is Mini-Me.
Yeah. Before you guys start,
take over match me when I kick the bucket, but no, he's Mini-Me at the moment. Yeah, Mike.
Before you guys start arm wrestling over the details here, I'm ashamed to have to say this. There is a way to resolve this.
Oh, already?
Dynamic.
We're going to say that for later,
that ruins the theater. Okay. Yeah?
You model it your way. I'll model it my way, and let's see what replicates reality.
So Mike's volunteered to be the referee. Is basically what he's saying.
In a Minsky match. Okay.
In
Yeah,
a
Minsky
Minsky
man,
man.
yeah.
Or what do you call it? It's what to call it Ravel these days, but it's basically Minsky we're modeling with there. So, yeah, Minsky mauling, a Ravel rage. How about a Ravel rage? Have a
Yeah.
Ravel rage, and whoever gets it right wins. So I'm going to say the Treasury creates reserves. Okay, that's my boxing bag, and you're saying the central bank does.
The central bank creates reserves. So let's actually get into it. Obviously, so the context there, we generate. I know Steve agrees with the totality of my thread and what I was saying, but in one of the thread posts, I said, I paraphrase here that the Fed is entirely creating these reserves, and you came and said, well, this is an act of government spending. So talk a little bit about that and what you mean, and then maybe I'll nuance with my opinion.
Okay. Well, I'm going to actually tell you what. I'm going to hit you with a Ravel model on the screen. So here I go for screen sharing. Let's see if I'll get my Ravel model up here. Because I'm starting. You know me. I start from absolute basics. So is it H to share the screen? I keep on forgetting that. Not H. It's the wrong thing. I'll try again. H. Nope, that doesn't work. Okay, come down here, share screen, press H, entire screen, that one. Okay, so here's my case, okay? And I'm starting from the absolute basics because we know that if the government runs a deficit, what that means is it's spending more on the private sector than it's taxing the private sector. So your starting point is you've got to make the entry deficit into the deposit accounts because that's the gap between spending and taxation, okay? So that's the starting point. Now, how do you balance it? What's your second entry? There's only one choice. Okay, it's got to go in reserves. Okay?
Oh, okay.
Okay, so I now have as the deficit increases bank liabilities, it also increases bank assets. And pardon me, I've got to. So I can actually. Yeah, here we go. It's working. Okay, this is the edit mode, which doesn't work all that well in Ravel right now. Doing it on screen rather than bringing it up. So I've got that line correct. And now I've got to say, well, for whom are reserves an asset? Reserves. Right, let's come down here. The deposits are an asset of the private sector. So now I've got to type deposits down here. And Ravel will bring across that operation here. There's no liability attached to it for the private sector. So I'm going to call this, and pardon the double meaning here, but I'm going to call this private equity. The net worth of the private sector. So what that means is the deficit is increasing the net worth of the private sector. And that's one of the points of MMT which I 100% concur with. I can just show it more intelligently than they can because they haven't made anything like Ravel and I can't get the buggers to use it. But anyway, this is showing the deficit creates net financial assets for the private sector. Then I've got to go through the rest of the system and say, well, this is reserves as a asset of the banking sector for whom it is a liability, and that's the central bank. So I now type reserves here, and I get I should be getting that coming across as an operation. There we go. Okay, so now I've got to say, well, where does the deficit come from? I've got deficit is increasing reserves. How are they actually created? And I'll just actually turn on the row column buttons here so that I can add an extra liability for the bank. I'll just make this one a bit wider so you can see it more easily. So there's another asset, and this what's the title used for the Treasury's account?
CGA?
CGA, so Consolidated Government Account. Okay, so if I've got the deficit is an increase in reserves, it's also a fall in the CGA, and that's the point where people think there have to be funds in there before that can actually be done. So now I've got that stage covered. And now the final thing is, well, I've got the CGA as a liability for whom is it an asset? And the answer is the CGA is an asset for the Treasury. So I type CGA here. Across that operation comes. There's no liability attached to it. So I now say this is the Treasury equity. Boom, boom. And now one of the little tools in Ravel, I can right click and say, actually, it doesn't work. Let's see. No, it's not actually in this. It's in the large menu. But what it means is I've got to show that the deficit decreases the financial equity of the Treasury. Now there I've got the entire pattern absolutely starting from ab initio. So there's no, it's the absolute foundational effort of MMT. And what I get is the government creates the reserves, which are down here, by going to negative equity for itself. That then means a transfer of deficits, the deficit to actually put the money into people's bank accounts. The deficit means the CGA goes down and reserves go up. So the creation of reserves, which you can see over here, is caused by the Treasury. And that's my first blow on this cage match. So over to you, Kai.
So a classic MMT mistake. What actually happens first is open market operations. And so open market operations, there is a degree of, and we heard about this with Ben Bernanke doing a number of interviews 15 years ago, that the New York Fed and Treasury are highly coordinated, and they'll have weekly minutes. So Tim Geithner was sitting down with Henry Paulson. What was his name? Paulson. Back in the day, and they were highly coordinated. I don't know to the degree that's happening today, obviously, with the political climate. So there was a degree that supports Steve's view that, government spending is essentially creating these reserves. But what actually happens in the U.S. first is what we call treasury auctions or open market operations. And so treasury auctions. No. There's no buts. There's no buts. The account, the TGA has to be in positive territory before the spending can happen. That is an operational reality of the U.S. System right now, and the liability of reserves is owned on the Federal Reserve balance sheet. They are, and if you take it out in little notes, they're called Federal Reserve notes. Therefore, they are created by the Federal Reserve. And I'll go a little bit further, as that is not the only operation that creates reserves. You also have lending facilities out of the Federal Reserves. And the biggest one is discount window lending facilities, where commercial banks can go to the discount window and get a loan, which creates new reserves. So the operation actually starts with the reserves being created first. I am not arguing that the Fed and the Treasury do not coordinate to make sure there are enough reserves in the system so the treasuries can be bought by primary dealers. But what I am saying, it is not the act of spending first that creates the reserves. The reserves are created first by operations in the Federal Reserve.
What I'm doing is saying, historically, where did it all come from? And for the reserves to exist in the first place, the government, the Treasury, has to create the spending initially. And like if you say, where did you could actually have a system with no bond sales, and this is the pure starting point of a government system. The government can spend without having to sell bonds at all. So if it does that, what actually happens is the CGA goes negative. Now, the CGA is not allowed to go negative by laws. It's not by accounting. It'd be quite possible for the CGA to go into deficit. And with the dynamics I'm showing here so far, it doesn't even cause the Treasury to go into negative, the central bank to go into negative equity. So if I show this starting from the initial point of the government spending money by creating money fundamentally, which, you go back to the days of the greenback and its creation of the greenback and creation of the pound and all that sort of jazz. It's actually the government's decision to spend that sets the whole system off. So you could work this way. The negative of not having bond sales is the CGA would go negative, so the CGA would be in overdraft. But the only reason that's a problem is because laws were passed by governments after we created a whole system that say the CGA must always be positive or non-negative. So in practical, because of that law, then the Treasury has to sell the bonds initially. If there's not enough in the CGA to finance it, then the Treasury's got to sell the bonds to do that. And what the central bank does is it does open market operations and repos and so on to convert existing bonds into reserves. And therefore, hey presto, there are funds that can buy the Treasury auction, and then the funds are in the Treasury, and then they can spend.
And that part I agree with. And so this is the part where I'll agree with MMTers, and I'll defend them, is that I often remind people to know that the treasuries are in existence first. And so there's an argument there, and this is a very circular one, that, is it the chicken or the egg? Did the reserve create the reserves first to buy the treasuries and open market operations, or were the reserves started first? And that's an origin story, and it's not really applicable to our little debate here. But the reality is it is the Federal Reserve creating the reserves, and they do it a number of ways, and it's not just because there's government spending going on, right? So that's my gripe with the MMT position, where they say government spending creates money. It is a component of it, but it's not all of it.
So is there always government spending? Because I'm curious if you could isolate that out and look at money creation without government spending. Is there an instance where that happens and it leads more to a Ty's position?
Sure,
I
quantitative
guess the government's
easing.
always spending, right? But I mean, is there an instance where you could look at where there is no government spending and yet we can quantitatively say that
it's
there's
called
that's private. That's bank lending, private bank lending. Yeah,
and
that's
how does
yeah.
Okay, sorry, go ahead.
Ask the question. Yeah.
And then the other thing I was going to ask is two questions. Why does this really matter? Really? Because I'm like, not seriously. I'm really looking at it going. I mean, I know it was a reference of a chicken or egg thing.
Yeah.
And then how does Mike set up the experiment to run two different comparisons and model two different scenarios? Like, is there truth, or is there a way to derive some value out of those two competing models? Because I don't know if they're significant enough to really.
Funnily enough, no. We're talking about exactly the same structure. It's just which time are you looking at it? So if you're looking at it ab initio, then the government has to spend initially to start the whole system off. And also the government has to create the relative price level. This is one of the points that Warren Mosler makes that I agree with about government spending and how that relates to the price level in an economy that it spends into. But you've got to have the government doesn't have to issue the bonds first of all, because this is the MMT point: which comes first, the chicken or the egg? If the government has to sell bonds before it can actually spend in the very first instance, then there's no money in existence and no reserves in existence. So how can they sell the bonds? So in a sense, the government has to kickstart the whole system by spending first of all, and then. But then what you get is a build-up of bonds. And this is where, like Ty and I, the reason we're fighting each other is because there's a bunch of people in the middle. We both want to punch, okay? So throwing a punch at Ty means we smash somebody else in the face on the way through, and that's the real objective. But what a lot of the people who talk about, they call tabs, so tax and bonds before spending. And there's another Canadian, one of the Canadians I don't like. I've forgotten what he calls himself, but he's a
progressive Canadians. I remember that guy.
Pain in the ass. Yeah. Mind you, I know a couple of MMTs. I like to put them in the same room because they could annoy the shit out of each other, which would be improve the world if they both pissed each other off. But he argues the government has to tax and sell bonds before it spends. And the point of the MMT is, well, that first of all, initially that can't happen. That can't be the origin story. And then secondly, the taxing and spending is a fairly mechanical operation for the government overall, because there's already all these bonds in existence. And particularly now we're living in a period of excess reserves. There's both bonds that are owned by the private sector and the private banks, and there's reserves that are owned by the private banks as well. And then if there happen to be not enough reserves in existence, then that's the pre-global financial crisis situation. The post-global financial crisis situation for the UK, for example, is that the outstanding level of reserves right now is equivalent to roughly 30% of GDP, which is huge. Now, with that 30% of GDP, if the government treasury does a bond auction, then fundamentally, if there was not interest being paid on reserves, it'd be a no-brainer. But even with interest being paid on reserves, when the government issues bonds, the bond price is always above the reserve interest rate. And of course, you can't trade reserves. You can lend them, but you can't trade them. whereas you can trade bonds, and therefore the huge bond market comes out of this operation. So if there happened in the current situation, with the number of auctions that happens in the UK, I'm not sure about Canada and the USA. We can talk about this if people know the details. But I just checked up recently, and there's about 100 bond auctions per year in the UK. They call them gilt auctions. And therefore, if the deficit was 10% of GDP, and it's nowhere near that, it's about 6% of GDP, even if it was 10% of GDP, the number of bonds sold on average at each auction is equal to 0.1% of GDP, which means the amount of reserves in existence are roughly 300 times the level necessary to completely buy all the existing bonds. So in this current situation, because they're partly required to, you can only be part of the bond auction if you participate. If you don't make a bid, you can lose the status. But also because reserves earned less interest and can't be traded, bonds earned more interest and can be traded, they're going to buy the bond. They're going to, if the central bank offers to buy bonds off the private banks and the non-bank sector by increasing reserves, they're going to take the deal, sell the bonds to the central bank. That creates the reserves. Then when the auction takes place, they use the reserves to buy the bonds issued by the government. The money turns up in the account and the government can then spend. And it's a mechanical, relatively trivial, very complicated, but nonetheless fundamentally trivial operation to make sure that there's funds in the CGA to enable the government spending to take place. Yeah. And people like Jeff Eder, think
Jeff Eder, that's his name.
Jeff Eder, yeah. He was actually quite a friend for a while until I analysed Stephanie's. I didn't understand this initially, I must say. I understood private money creation. That was my specialty. And then when I read the deficit myth, Stephanie said, if I was asked how the government created money when having specialised in private money creation, I would say things like it creates money to the extent to which the central bank buys the bonds. And then in the deficit myth, what Stephanie insisted was the actual act of the deficit itself creates money. Thought I better check that. Whacked in a ravel. 10 minutes later, I realised Stephanie was right. I say that on my Patreon blog, and Jeff Eder goes ballistic and starts accusing me of having been bought out, for example, which fucking pisses me off. Okay,
by a French physician on the far left. Yeah, sounds like a good theory.
That was the crux of my argument. That really bothers people in the private sector that are in the treasury market, because they feel like they are funding the government. So that it goes beyond holding an asset and making money either through capital gains or interest payments. There's an ideology behind it where they feel like I am a participant in funding the government. And what my argument is none of that can happen unless there's a settlement system behind it. And of course, the settlement system is reserves, and ultimately, it is settled in reserve. So, what you have as a private sector individual is being a secondary operator in that situation, where you have the luxury of exchanging your low interest to zero interest bearing dollars. Of course, you can put those in other assets for a safe asset, which is a U.S. Treasury, and that's a benefit for you. But it's not a funding operation for the government, because even if the primary dealers that don't hold accounts with the Fed say, well, you know what, we're not participating. One, they would be kicked out of the dealer program in the U.S. There's 28 dealers. They would be kicked out because they're required to bid. And two, the 5 banks that are dealers would be like, okay, well, we got, what Steve was saying, 30% of GDP, all these reserves. What else are we going to do with it? The interbank market isn't big enough for us to loan all these out. Might as well go buy these treasuries. And it's just a circle jerk between
a no-brainer. Yeah,
it's really a triangle. So Basil Moore Basil Moore does it with private sector bank, but it also exists, that triangle between the Treasury, the central bank, and commercial banks. There's
going to find another. Throw another low blow at Ty here. It's actually Augusto Graziani. You put the triangle.
Graziani.
There you go. Okay.
Graziani.
Okay. That's an elbow bend. Okay, I got you on the floor. I'm building the left elbow.
Hey, but look,
elbows up, boys.
The thing that occurs to me you know, as an outsider on all this, is the narrative.
You're the referee, okay? We've got you as the referee.
No, Mike's definitely referee on this.
He's got to go to the Tesla to make sure I haven't done any dirty blows. I haven't kicked below the belt yet. Mind you, I'm tempted.
Observation, right? So you've got the narrative, which is the what if, you know, people stop buying the government debt and everything.
Oh, it's terrifying. The bond vigilantes are here.
So, yeah, exactly. So that narrative.
Wait,
is
that
really
again,
powerful.
Steve. Let's put you full screen.
And is it really important to unpack all this so that argument can be put to bed? Is that what's going on? Because it feels like
yeah, it's a bullshit argument, and we're both pissed off with it, and we're throwing punches at each other to knock out the idiots who say they're bond vigilantes.
Well, what about, so maybe, like, you've started to unpack that. I'd love a killer blow to that argument based on like Steve's version so far to me is the one that makes the most sense, because I like to see the clarity of it pulled apart so that if it was just a massive overdraft, for example, you'd have this big, pretty scary number, but it's just
a negative number at the central bank for the government. Obviously, up in arms, it's terrifying.
Exactly. It's a big number. So what? Yeah. Like, who do you owe it to? Mars? It's irrelevant, right? So that's quite compelling. So I would take Steve so far in terms of descriptive power alone, Ty. Sorry about that. But that's where that's the problem I see.
Let me
wait one second.
His head is spinning here. Okay, yeah.
but notice that the problem that's with an emergent system like this is that it's built up with all these layers that now it's quite convenient for people who benefit from the status quo to go, well, it's really complex and it's actually like this. And it's almost like the lack of clarity allows people to get away with these narratives. And I think that's half the problem.
Yeah, lack of clarity defines the opposition, okay? Because none of them have done the double entry bookkeeping that Ty and I do in our sleep these days with Ravel, and they make claims which actually contradict the double entry bookkeeping, and that's why we get, again. I mean, as much as we both love Bob Murphy, who's a good bloke, he doesn't understand, for example, that the model of the money multiplier, when you put it in accounting terms, the only way it works is if all loans are in cash or other negotiable instruments. And having not done the double entry bookkeeping, he doesn't think that's the case. But when you do it, the only way the model works is loans have to be in cash. And then that means what you got is, for the textbook version of how banks create money, it works in the 19th century when you might get loans in cash. But it can't work in the 20th or 21st, and you certainly cannot. And I've seen what's called the marginal revolution, that particular online website about neoclassical bullshit. Pardon me, I'm at economics. They argue, they simply showed at some point, they showed the loans happens, and this is, you'll find it on the Marginal Revolution website. They say the loan, you get $100, $1,000 deposited, hang on to 100, lend out 900, and they show that loan, and they say, and that goes into the borrower's deposit account. No, it doesn't. That violates the laws of accounting. That's what we're trying to show here.
So I want to answer. I just want to cover this about dropping the treasuries, and then I want to get Mike in to give his opinion before he's got to go. It's in 15 minutes. One of the things, this is what I find dangerous about the MMT position. Well, let's just drop treasuries. You want the fastest way for the opponents to bring back the gold standard. Eliminate government bonds, right, as a means to offset and balance between government spending and call it debt, whatever you want to call it. That would be the fastest way to make that happen. And if one country did it, that currency would drop like a rock. So it's just not a feasible thing, right? We need a market instrument that values these dollars out there. And that's what the treasury bills, government bonds do. And it's a safe asset the government is creating, not the private sector, and that's something that I want to keep. And eliminating that also opens the door for these stupid ass things like Bitcoin or these gold bugs bringing in a gold reserve. So I'm very, very opposed to just letting the central bank go into an overdraft, and I'm also very opposed to politicians having control of the money supply, especially when they're elected every 4 years wars, and you have individuals like Donald Trump in power. So those are some of my dangers of simplifying it too much and just saying, well, let's do away with the bond system,
Yeah.
let the Treasury go into overdraft, and you know what? Then the system looks a whole lot simpler, and we can explain it that way, and tickety boo, away we go. That's
and
my
those layers have been built up from trying to find ways to offset the dangers. Is that what you're saying? Because
no, no. Let's be clear. That's a historic artifact of the gold standard. It's evolved into what it is now, and there are benefits to having treasury bonds in the system. They do fund important things like retirement packages, etc., etc. They do give a signal to a currency's value. They do provide a safe asset that, if not there, the private sector would fill with an unsafe asset. They keep the gold bugs at bay because we provide something that we control as a public versus something we dig out of the ground that is found at random. So those are the kind of things. It's an evolution to what it is now, but it serves purposes.
Yeah, the gold standard created limits that weren't controllable. It seemed like you couldn't adjust. It was inflexible. That's the simplest way I can state it. But I wrote an article recently because I was having a thought experiment on the dark side of MMT, basically, because I don't think there's enough dark imagination about what politicians would do if they really got hold of MMT as a theory and said, oh yeah, of course, let's interpret government spending that way. And it just seemed to me that MMT has assumed that the only people that would ever be in power with a true understanding of MMT would be woolly lefties. And no, a Nigel Farage would quite happily spend money into existence to fund, detention centres and a ramped up defence policy and all sorts of things. It's just that. So, Ty, it's a very important point you made about politicians having control of the purse in a way that may be much more uncontrolled. I think that's really important to think about too.
Let's Mike, start talking here, buddy. It's been 30 minutes.
Yeah, we're talking into the ground.
I guess my overall impression of listening to the battle royale here is that a big part of the problem in economics and the general public is the mental models that people have.
Yeah.
As Lord Keynes told us years ago, it's the fallacy of composition. You think you think of the whole economy and the national budget like your household economy and your household budget, and you think it's the same. In other words, you have the wrong mental model. And I think this permeates business, government, highly educated people, what have you. And in some sense, it makes sense that people would, look around and what they experience on a daily basis. They're not central bankers, most citizens, right? That it's intuitively appealing to think of it that way, but it's not right. But as Steve was whisking his way through the Minsky or Ravel godly tables there and what have you, which is a wonderful software advancement, I'm thinking to what Randy Ray and Stephanie Kelton used to say, that nobody understands what we're saying because nobody understands T accounts, which is the old accounting.
Understands what?
T accounts.
Oh, they're boring. T accounts. That's
when I took accounting years ago, that's what was before spreadsheets.
That's why I invented Minsky, because T accounts are shit.
So, but what I'm getting at is someone who is, I would say I was following 90% of what you were saying because you were going a little quick, but I could imagine my dad, who was an accountant, I could imagine him sitting here, God rest his soul, and going, what the F is going on here? Trying to understand as you're trying to walk people through, so it's a complicated thing, right? Yeah. And trying to get even somebody interested in economics, seriously interested in economics, to understand it, let alone the average citizen. I don't know. It's just, there's so much going. It's a complicated system.
Yeah.
And even using modern simulation tools rather than T accounts, it's just, so I don't know what the answer is because, for anybody to learn exactly mechanically how the system works, because it's mostly a mechanical system, right?
It is. It's the actual system structure we're
Yeah,
talking about.
there's some subjective stuff. Do we want the public sector to pick up the garbage, or hire your own trash haulers, or is our national defense big enough or small enough? Stuff like that. There's a political process of some sort that happens, whether it's a dictatorship or pure democracy or representative republic or whatever.
Yeah.
And then that's decided, the size of the public sector, and then the rest is kind of mechanical.
Yeah.
And so it's not like conservative, liberal, radical, whatever. It's just mechanically how the friggin' system operates.
Yeah.
But it is complicated, and they muddy the water, as you said earlier, guys, where they start adding laws, debt ceilings, and stuff that aren't necessary, but they come from incorrect mental models.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
And it makes it even more complicated. So what the answer is, I don't know. But I think you're actually a very wonderful example that you talked us through kind of illustrates this point.
I got a mechanic to throw at you guys.
Okay.
So I'm really to reiterate what Mike's saying. It is confusing, but let me add a little bit more context. When it comes to the approval of spending in America, and I believe that's through Congress. So within your model, like I'm leaning towards Ty's interpretation here, although I'm going to say that, to me, I think that the bond market is also speculative, whether it's through futures or whatever.
Yeah.
So there's almost like I was going to say a priori sort of thing, but whatever. It's like a prior to the spending happening, the mechanism is being primed. Prior to that, it could happen on rumors with spending. The engine is starting to go, right? Basically, as I don't know, what are they, bills that are put forward to Congress for spending? So to me, that sounds like it's building on Ty's case that there's multiple inputs into this mechanism, right? This complex system. Is that fair?
Yeah.
To say?
I mean, it's and you have to understand the entire structure. And the mainstream economic theory began with no concept of the structure of the banking system, and ended up with a model where they have two halves to their model of banking and money. One is the money multiplier that supposedly explains money creation, and the other is loanable funds that supposedly explains the actions of banks. One doesn't work unless all loans are in cash, which is garbage, and the other can't handle demand deposits, because when you make a deposit at a bank, the reality is that if you started a new savings account at the bank and put $1,000 in, and then came back an hour later and found there was $100 inside there, and the bank says, "Oh, we've lent the other 900 out. Is that okay by you?" Fuck no, it's not. Give me my money back. Okay, demand deposits are not supposed to be affected by lending. So loanable funds can show effectively time deposits, because you put $1,000 into a time deposit. Yes, the bank does have the right to lend out 900, and you've got to wait until you can get your money back. But demand deposits, it can't handle at all. So, but they know, so that's okay. It's as if banks are operating as intermediaries, so they enable savers to lend to borrowers. So savers know their accounts are going down and borrowers' accounts go up. And that's what, it isn't really what happens, but it's as if, and that's good enough for us. And that's the sort of garbage we've got to get rid of. So a large part of this argument is over the not understanding and not wanting to understand what the structure of the banking system is.
That's probably from the history of the small burst bubble banks that happened in the early days of America, right? I mean, all the tiny little banks that appeared and disappeared, and
it actually goes right back to Adam Smith and Jean Baptiste Say, because they fundamentally argued that banking is transparent. Like Jean Baptiste Say said that capitalists do not wish to accumulate money. Okay, they want to buy goods. So money is to veil over barter, and then the whole barter vision of what banking is, that became the neoclassical concept. Yes. So their macro models do not include banks or debt or money, and their justification is money is just to veil over barter. Here are our models of banking. That's what happens in the banking sector. It doesn't matter, because lending doesn't increase spending power. Credit does not increase aggregate demand. So we can leave it out, and that's the end of the story. And the thing is, they've persuaded themselves and all that, and it's complete nonsense.
There's a good question, I think, that's relevant from Thomas D. There is it true the U.S. savings and loans that Volcker destroyed with the 20% interest were loanable funds institutions? I mean, I thought
yes, it is true. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So your savings and loans, well, literally, this is the stuff. What's the old movie? It's a beautiful world.
It's a Wonderful Life.
It's a wonderful,
wonderful
life.
life, but a
Great
shit
movie.
system.
Well, a shit system. Great movie. But in that movie, it literally is a savings and loans. And in savings and loans, you put your money in. That went into a time deposit, which you could not access without giving like a month's notice. But that would then be used to lend funds to somebody to build a house somewhere. And so what that is literally the community pools its funds. Some people borrow out of it, and they then build a house. And then the interest they pay on the loan they've taken out goes back to the building society to enable it to cover its costs and maybe make a profit. But it was all, there's no money creation in that system. So that's the loan, and that's enough. The neoclassicals are happy with that model, and they pretend that describes the banking sector, which is completely false.
But the question was that they really existed in theory and in practice back then.
They do. Yeah,
they acted as if that was real. Yeah. So
yeah, I've forgotten what we did. Mike, you might know better than me. Maybe Try knows as well. What was the so-called reform, which I prefer to call the deform, that gave us the savings and loan crisis? What was it? I've forgotten.
Mike? Oh, that was in the 80s.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, like we should have
not the Spengler thing where they
William Black
it's
on
called
one day.
it's the act. I forget the name of the act.
Reagan signed it.
Yeah, I forget the name. And that was when they separated. Was that when they separated or allowed savings and loans and commercial banking to separate? I can't remember the name of that.
Yeah, by law, it was always a savings and loans could pay like 0.5% higher than the commercial banks, and it's all very structured.
Now, so it's safe to say that banks are intermediators in the fact that they do sell financial assets that you can invest in. Those assets, of course, are using your bank deposits, and those are invested in other projects. So there's lots of ways, not to sound like George Selgin here, but there's lots of ways to say, yeah, banks do perform intermediary operations. Mike's got to go. Mike, have fun teaching the kids.
Shall be done.
Okay.
I'll say hello to them for y'all.
Do that indeed. See you, mate. Bye-bye.
See ya.
Okay, bye-bye.
So no, it's banks do that. So like it was formed with savings and loans banks before they were rolled up in the 1980s. You could see that highlight it more. But banks are technically intermediators in that fact. Of course, but when you just say it out loud, the thing that comes to the people's minds is, well, my deposits are being used to be loaned out to other people. No, you have to go through the act of buying a financial product with your deposits first, and then your balance goes down, right? And so that's just an important nuance. But this is great. I took down Steve in less than 5 minutes at the beginning of the show, brutally. It was like watching Logan Paul and Mike Tyson fight 4 months ago. It was brutal. It was
hyped and then brutally short. Is that what
you're asking? You're in for it.
What I do remember from It's a Wonderful Life and that whole system that existed then was that George Bailey, the character played by James Stewart, was basically putting his entire life on hold for all the stuff that he actually wanted to do with his life to bail out a shit system, and that it kept on happening. And that's what I always took away from that film, was that, okay, hang on, there's a big problem with the system. Can you fix it? Because it just seemed very open to the big capitalist that came along at the end, like throughout the whole thing, from just basically raping the system because he could monopolize it and just shafting people. That's my impression of the loanable funds system. I don't know if it's scientifically verifiable, but that's how
what I've been trying to shoot loanable funds out of the water, because I'm sick of this nonsense model dominating how people think about wanking. Pardon me, I meant banking. So I've been trying to cut it down to the simplest possible model that can show the difference. And I've done that. I'm actually giving a talk at the Jeremy Corbyn's Peace and Justice Program conference on Sunday week. And what I want to communicate to them is that all the arguments about the government deficits being destructive is completely wrong. And all this stuff about, having to save government money is nonsense. And so to start it off, I've said, this is what the textbooks teach people about banks, that they're intermediaries and they don't actually create money. So, and whereas the Bank of England came out in 2014, and they've ignored the Bank of England. They ignored me and all my predecessors beforehand. But the Bank of England said bank loans create money. So I wanted to find what's the minimum possible system that I can illustrate that with, and I've done it. So can I show it to you in Ravel?
Yeah.
Do the share screen again. Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so let's just go and do here and share screen. Okay, so that one, I'll make it full screen and maximize a bit. So this is fundamentally what's being taught in terms of loanable funds, as they do it supply and demand curves. This is the real world where you use double entry bookkeeping. So what they have is you have the bank hangs on to reserves. They have people who save and people who borrow, and savers lend to borrowers. So you have credit dollars per year coming out of savers accounts and going into borrowers, and that can be positive or negative, goes either way. And then you look at the saver's point of view. The saver has two assets, the bank account. If the bank account goes down because of lending, the debt, which is their other asset, goes up. And then for the borrowers, they've got an asset and a liability. They have money in their bank account, which can rise like credit dollars per year if they borrow money. But to do that, their debt goes up at the same time. So that's the model and the actual structure. Now, to make it into an economic model, I've just very simply said money is the sum of what's in those two bank accounts. You got money times money velocity gives you GDP, and then credit some fraction of GDP. So incredibly simple model. And if I now simulate this, run it here, and I've got GDP being generated and credit is zero. If I change money velocity, I change GDP, but it's quite a mechanical. It's just how fast existing money turns over. If I change credit, nothing happens. So I'm bumping up the amount of credit. It's currently £10 per year in a £200 economy. Let's make it £20 per year. Absolutely nothing happens. If I go down to negative credit, so people are repaying debt, equally nothing happens. So in this world, you can ignore private lending. Now, the point the Bank of England made is that it's not true to say the debt is an asset of the savers. The savers don't lend, the banks do. So I can say, well, that's true. Therefore, the debt is not an asset of the savers, and they're not doing the lending either. So I delete those two rows. Where do I put it? I now say the debt is an asset of the banking sector. So I type debt up here as an asset of the banking sector. Oh, bloody hell, what have I done? Non-liability column. What have I done wrong? Great, I've stuffed up my demo. Isn't that great? I'll try again. DEB2. I've still got it as an asset of the savers down here. So I've got rid of it as an asset of the savers. Now I say it's an asset of the banks. And so credit actually increases the asset of the banks and increases the liability as well. It's all balanced. Now what happens if you have lending? So I'm starting at zero, same situation. If credit is positive, GDP grows. And if credit goes negative, credit's still positive here, I'll bring it down to negative, GDP plunges. Credit drives GDP. This is the point we're trying to get through in criticizing neoclassicals on loanable funds, and Ravel makes it easy to demonstrate the huge difference between a world in which banks are intermediaries and a world in which banks are what I call originators of money and debt. So we live in a BOM system. We don't live in loanable funds. And BOM stands for bank originated money and debt. And that's the difference. You might as well be going from a Ptolemaic flat earth vision, which is loanable funds, to a sun-centric vision, which is BOMmed.
And, if you were a household type mentality, you don't even have to have a stance. You're just a regular person who just thinks that the government works just like a household as well. It sounds like a massive scam that that deficit spend amount, it doesn't need to be paid back. It's like, what? That's just like free money. I mean, what would you say to someone who's at that level of thinking about this understanding?
This gets more complicated because I've got to tell people about equity. And like I noticed, Ty, you made a big song and dance about equity in one of your recent posts as well, understanding what equity is. And equity is the gap between your assets and your liabilities. So it's your net worth. And if you're working in financial assets, and I've learned this the hard way by building Ravel, financial assets are your claims on somebody else. There are non-financial assets, things like houses, factories, infrastructure, and so on. And a non-financial financial asset is an asset to its owner and a liability to no one. So you can have positive non-financial assets in net terms, and that's everything we see around us. It's physical is a non-financial asset in that sense. They're short-lived. They're food. I bought a couple of bottles of wine. That's a non-financial asset for me at the moment. We'll drink it tonight. I'll be drunk. That'll be goodbye non-financial asset. It's gone. I've consumed it. But houses and stuff like that last forever, and that's what we should be building by using the monetary system to create it. But a financial asset is your claim on somebody else. A financial liability is somebody else's claim on you. And when you add up all financial assets and liabilities, you get zero. This is an incredibly important point. So if the sum of all financial assets and financial liabilities is zero. Therefore, if any entity whatsoever in the system is in positive financial equity, the remainder of the system is in negative financial equity with respect to that entity to the precise, fraction of a cent. So if somebody's in positive equity, then the rest of the system is in identical negative equity with respect to them. That's the starting point. Then you say, what about banks? Well, banks, by definition, have to have assets that exceed their liabilities. This is, again, short-term assets. A bank whose short-term assets are less than its short-term liabilities is bankrupt. Okay, so the banking sector as a whole must be in positive financial equity. That means the rest of the economy, including the government here, must be in negative financial equity with respect to the banks. Now, so that's a given. That is an absolute given of a capitalist economy. Then you look at the non-bank private sector. That means the non-bank private sector, because the bank sector must be positive equity, the non-bank private sector must be in negative financial equity itself, unless the government is in bigger negative equity itself. So the only way for the non-bank private sector to have assets, short-term assets, which exceed their short-term liabilities is if the government goes into negative equity. And this then, I think, explains a huge part of the crazy behavior we see over time, that people who, because the governments are obsessed with getting into positive financial equity themselves, they end up driving down the level of government debt. That reduces the positive equity of the non-bank private sector. They then think, oh, Jesus, our assets are less than our liabilities. I know what we can do. Let's go to the local bank and borrow money and buy non-financial assets, houses, shares, yada, yada, yada. Watch their prices go up and we'll end up in overall positive equity. And that gives us bloody financial bubbles. So the government is tempting to...
Sorry, Dan's got to bounce here. Dan, it was nice for you to drop,
thanks, mate. You got us in raving mode here.
Yep. Yeah, pleasure as always.
Okay.
Keep up the good fight.
See you next week, mate.
Come back next week.
Okay, guys.
Yeah. So the punchline for this is,
I gotta wait for that. I gotta wait for the punchline. Okay, go on.
If you don't want to be in negative financial equity, you need the government to be in negative financial equity. And so even Austrians who think that it's terrible to have government at all, unless the government exists and has liabilities that exceed its assets, financial liabilities that exceed its financial assets, the private sector is going to be in negative financial equity.
And who would you rather?
Yeah, exactly.
I don't want to. I'd rather the government's holding the can rather than me.
It's easier than you. And so this is the great irony. Unless the government runs a deficit, the private sector is going to be in negative financial equity, and that's going to cause all sorts of angst. You can't get out of it. It's absolutely given. You might be able to get yourself into a situation individually where your financial assets exceed your financial liabilities. That pushes the rest of the society even more into negative financial equity. So the only surefire solution is for the government to go into negative financial equity and stop everybody else being fucking stupid.
So this answers your question, Zoe. The only thing that really matters in that relationship between the assets and liabilities of bank is, like Steve said, the whole banking business model is based on your short-term assets have to exceed your long-term
Liability.
short-term liabilities, or you're bankrupt. And of
Mm.
course, as Steve was saying, if that's the case, then necessarily relative to them, everybody else is a negative equity. The government steps in, of course, will clean that up, as Steve put so eloquently. I will go a little bit further because
With
I
a few
saw
spare
this.
words. Yeah.
I saw this question, Zoe, and beyond that, there's no meaning. And I had this discussion, and Steve was in on it too, about a month ago, about the stupidity of fractional reserve banking. You can
Mm.
have fractional reserve mortgages to deposits, fractional this, fractional that, fractional every other goddamn thing. It means nothing from a behavioral sense, nothing that I can identify
Mm.
in the macro economy. So in that respect, no, it's meaningless. Other than a bank has to be in positive equity in order to survive, and that can be through any variation of assets exceeding any variation of liabilities. So,
Mm.
Zoe, you got your answer from Steve. What do
We
you
need
think?
another round.
What are you thinking there, Mr. Folks?
I'm thinking about. I was back to thinking about just how we got in this pickle where this whole emergent slush pile of rules and regs and trying to work it all out has landed us in a situation where it feels still like anyone can argue anything, as long as people aren't paying attention. And I think,
Fundamentally, that's true. Yeah.
yeah, and I think because it's so complex, and I think that really shits me because I'm no engineer, but we love technology that you just pick it up and it works because it's clear what it's supposed to do and so on. And the entire finance and money pipe and plumbing setup just feels like it's meant to confuse. It's not.
Mm.
It's emergent, I know, but that's sort of so untangling it. Well, obviously, we're not going to do it in the next hour, or are we? Stick around.
We could do it. I mean, like I can the bonds, if you like, in the godly tables I showed beforehand.
Before we do that, just I think so. What I notice is you guys will always put in the best effort to explain it rationally and so on. And I feel like what we're getting hiding on, right? This heterodox side of the debate is in they're just very hard to tell good narratives, good parables yet. And if I could help with that, I'd love to. But I don't think it's easy. I don't think these things are, especially complex systems, are easy to make metaphors of that people can buy into, especially positive ones, like the neoclassicals seem to have. The aspirational one. If you just work harder and spend a bit less than you earn, of course, that's how everyone can get ahead, including the government.
We can all get ahead at once. We can all be
not
up
at once. Yeah, exactly.
We have a slippery dip, which by magic, all sides can be up simultaneously.
But you see my point. It's like those narratives are very easy for people to grasp, and that is half.
Yeah, they're very seductive. It's just like our government is like a household, and I know how a household operates, so I know how the government works, and that's very simple. Just like the government, I've got a printing press in my balcony, and I can produce government. Oh, sorry, maybe it's different.
It doesn't work out. Yeah,
I don't go to that next step. So government's just like a household, and then bang, it's all about household, and therefore a household must spend less than it earns, and therefore we get into austerity, and we end up destroying the social system as a result.
Yeah, it's a really tough. Even if you can get people to the point of the government issues currency and households don't, then you're fighting the ghost of Milton Friedman and money printing, and the printer goes burr. It's so layered, all the false narratives out there through the economic history of the last century, that even if you penetrate one layer, you're gonna have to penetrate the next layer underneath that, and that's so incredibly difficult. And one of the other difficult things I realized, and this is a human condition, I think, is when you start describing, and this is system thinkers love this, describing a system, but once you start describing a system, you describe this to an individual, you're taking a bit of their individuality
It's
away.
taking the identity away from them. Absolutely. Yeah.
And that's
Oh yeah.
really uncomfortable that's another layer of the onion that's very hard to penetrate. And this goes back to the premise of this show. When you tell a bond vigilante or a person in the treasury market that, well, no, you aren't really funding the government at all. It's part of a much broader system that you are involved in.
Yeah.
That takes control of their individual choice away, and that is uncomfortable for any human being. And I find that's a very hard noodle for me to crack, even with the most logical, well-founded argument where I build a big set of godly tables, I
Yeah.
build a really good model. I can lay the truth in front of somebody's face, but if it goes contrary to their own individual beliefs about how they can individually act, and I don't want to sound like Ludwig von Mises here with human action, that's really hard for a human to accept. And I
Yeah.
just find that's a really hard one to penetrate.
It is. I mean, and it really is the fact that people's identity is locked up with their beliefs. And if you say your belief is false, then it means your identity is to some extent false. And the only way you can cope with that, there's only two ways. You either change your identity or you lie to yourself about what you've just seen. So the classic example of this actually is not in banking, it's actually in the cost structure of firms, because when you look at the empirical data, firms do not have what neoclassical economists call diminishing marginal productivity. When there's surveys done, they find that firms have either constant or falling marginal cost, which means their marginal productivity is actually a constant or rising. But neoclassical theory, well, it says that it can rise for a short-lived period when you've got very few variable factors added to a certain amount of fixed factors. But after you reach the ideal ratio, when you go beyond the ideal ratio of variable factors to fixed factors, so when you have a machine that needs 4 workers and you've got 5 workers on it, you're going to get more output out of the 5th worker, but less than the 4th. You're going to get diminishing marginal productivity. That's going to cause rising marginal cost. Now you go do the empirical research and find, sorry, mate, that's bullshit. All firms operate with spare capacity. No firm is stupid enough to put 5 workers onto a machine that needs 4 workers. They put 4 onto 4, and if they don't have enough demand, there's production lines they don't turn on, machines they don't turn on. When the demand expands, they take advantage of it, but they operate with excess capacity, so they don't face any of those problems at all. Now that's once you learn that, a whole number of people who did that research initially thought they'd find rising marginal cost, found no, it was constant or falling. They went through an existential crisis and they flipped out and ceased being neoclassicals and became post-Keynesian economists. So this is the beginning of post-Keynesian economics in the 1930s with what's called the Oxford Economic Group. And the number of people who discovered that, people like Hall and Hitch and quite a range of others, ultimately the most important one being Andrews, they just said, the theory is wrong. We need a different theory. And then they found themselves being rejected by the neoclassicals. So there's the divide. But the last person to do it was Alan Blinder, who was vice president of the American Economic Association, vice chairman of the Federal Reserve. He does a survey. What does he find? 89% of the firms, according to his results, reported constant or falling marginal cost. And he wrote it, said this is the overwhelmingly bad news for economic theory, is that only 11% of production seems to occur under rising marginal cost. Now, that was a huge shock. And his book, have a guess how many people have read his book?
7.
1.
Oh, blimey.
Okay. Going on Amazon reserves, there's only 1 review on Amazon of the book in 20-something years. Now, second question, guess who wrote the review?
You, Steve.
There you go, mate. Okay, I know you knew the answer.
We knew that was coming.
Okay, so I wrote the review. Okay,
but following up on that, Steve, there's a question there.
Years. The thing is, Alan Blinder contradicts his own research. His own textbook says rising marginal cost. He couldn't cope. He bullshitted his way back to his original belief. So his identity, he couldn't surrender the identity, as Ty was saying, too hard for him. So he lies about his own research.
Also, probably would have smashed his career. So there's for survival reasons, he would have to do that. And Thomas D's got another question there. I'm loving Thomas D's. It's like third question of his I've asked to pop up, but there's a book there that he's recommending to get people out of religious cults, and I wonder if we need to do an intervention on the on the lamestream
Yeah.
economics profession. Well, not
Did
Yeah.
you
mine.
just call,
You
did you
guys
just
can.
call it lame stream?
Maybe.
Oh, that's actually good. I haven't thought of that before.
It's not
Lamestream
actually
economics.
mine. I've pinched it from
Okay,
someone.
I've got
But,
it. That's a TKO to
but
Dave. He's knocked us
Nick
both
that.
out, mate.
Yeah.
Lamestream economics. I'm going to use that in future.
Oh, geez.
Good one.
So yeah, I mean, maybe that's what we need to treat it like. We're dealing with religious maniacs.
Well, it is religious. This is a diversion.
Well, they'd say we are.
Well, the thing is, this is what humans are, and people think that religious behavior is the opposite of scientific behavior. But I think the reality is they're very, very similar. The scientists began with a religious belief in the Aristotle's view of the universe, and extending and developing Aristotle's paradigm became astronomy, which is in many ways one of the fundamental sciences. And that people, as Kuhn realized, were not trying to contradict their hypotheses. They were trying to confirm their hypotheses. So when they got to the point they found anomalies, they'd try to fit the anomaly within the existing theory, and they'd never convert. So they'd stick with it till they died. But then what gave us science is, with observation coming in and with observations that contradict the theory, you then have a contradiction which young students are aware of. Some iconoclast like Max Planck has developed the contradictory explanation. The young students wait for the old teachers to die. When they die, the old students take over, and then you get a change. So you have you need revolutions to get change in sciences. And in that sense, while you're in a normal science, scientists behave like religious people, trying to confirm that their view of the real world is correct.
All right. Well,
ouch.
So
pardon me.
So we'll go back to the beginning of this stream, basically where I did a brutal takedown of Steve, and the record will show that
he must be a Republican. He's rewriting history.
Delusional. Yeah, were we talking about cults just before and false beliefs?
It's CULT. Change one letter.
So we CLO.
Wait for it.
Oh yeah, I can't. I'm trying to monetize the channel.
I can't let you do that. Okay.
Basically, let's sum it up. Steve and I both actually agree. And depending on how you look at the balance sheets, the liability is where it's at. We kind of covered it all, and I think we should just nuance here. I want to nuance at the end. I actually completely agree.
We're not going to hug at the end, how we never embrace
well,
and make up.
The thing is, as I replied to you, I completely agree. Let's do a live stream on it.
It's been fun, actually.
But let's move on. I want to talk about writing books. So I haven't put out my cover or anything like that, but you two have both authored books. Steve, you've authored quite a few, and you have one to your name so far, Dave. So I started about 2 years ago. I think I even sent you guys like a preface of my book. And then I had what's called writer's block.
Oh, yeah.
And I did
your first book.
Yeah. After the preface, I was screwed up. And so originally my idea was to write it on my national model, but then of course I linked up with modern macro technologies, and the equations have kind of be proprietary in a sense, and I couldn't divulge my model. I couldn't unmask Batman. So I switched gears, and about 6 months ago, I realized a writing technique, and I just want to not necessarily talk about my book. I'll start promoting it over the next few months. But I found a writing technique, and maybe even people in the audience so you can chime into, that really works well for me. And people might have noticed that I've been doing it in the public eye without people knowing, is I would write out a set of bullet points about what I want to talk about, because I'm not a good writer. Okay. I'm just not. I'm good at math. I'm not good at writing. So I'd write out a set of bullet points to keep the narrative on track in my own mind, because I have a lot of shit that goes up in here, and I probably need
We're
therapy.
Canadian. What can we say? Yeah.
I need therapy or less beer, one of the two. So
I'd go for beer. I'd go for therapy and take beer to the therapist. She probably drinks it.
I outlined this and I realized, okay, well, this is really cool. I could make a couple tweets out of this. And so I started doing these tweet threads. And Steve, you might have noticed them over the last 3 months
Yeah,
or
I
so.
have. There's a new development. Yeah.
And so I do those. And then I write a summary, which turn into my paid blogs on Patreon. And it's a summary. And I realized, okay, this is all the pieces I need to fully articulate this idea on a chapter. So I started doing this over and over. They were just separate little essays. And I was concerned. I saw a book forming, but I'm like, I don't want a book of essays, or it's useless to me. I want something cohesive. So I
Yeah.
just kept writing. And, I got to 17 chapters, 35,000 words. And I'm like,
That's
okay,
solid.
there's something here. And so then I took all of those chapters I wrote and I weaved a narrative between them, and I made sure the chapters. And so one of my biggest chapters, it's about 5,000 words, and it's at the beginning of the book, and I just finished writing it a few weeks ago, was on wealth. And I find the description of wealth in economics is so broad and so widely interpreted in different ways that I needed to tackle that first in order to get my other concepts out. And so I wrote these, and I have the set of 17 chapters, and I realized these are all just critiques. What are the answers? So a couple of weeks ago, I
The
decided,
chapter
okay,
10 problem, apparently it's called in
as,
publishing.
so
What
I,
problem?
The
so
chapter 10 problem.
yeah, so
Okay. Yeah.
I got to that and I realized, okay, well, how do I address that? I've critiqued economics. So basically, I've got Debunking Economics by Steve Keen Part 2 in my own words. That's great, but where do I go from here? And I'm like, okay, start doing some dynamic modeling and put a bunch of Greek letters and math equations and write appendices for each of my chapters. So my idea was each chapter I would do a small dynamic model. And so I got through about 10 of those chapters where I added the appendix at the end, right? And so it gave a solution of how it could be done. But I've read through my whole draft again, and I realized these are half-ass, half-baked ideas where I quickly inserted them. And so I came to this realization last week that really I can document my model. And I wanted to avoid math in this book since I started doing the 17 first chapters of like, I want this to be accessible from armchair economist on Twitter, first year Econ 101 student, but interesting enough to get the PhD thinking, the Dr. Steve Keen's out there to be like, he's onto something here. So it was very hard to dumb it down, but still keep it technical. And I realized I couldn't have math in this book, maybe the next one. And so then I realized I'm going to scrap these appendix out, and I'm going to narrate the next set, and it'll probably be another 7 chapters. So it is a big book. It'll probably be about 400 pages. And each chapter will describe my national model. And from a systems thinking perspective, anybody that knows Daniela Meadows, the wife of Dennis Meadows, one of the authors of The Limits of the Growth, she was a big proponent of systems thinking. So it wasn't necessarily mathematical system dynamic modeling. That only really includes a few people like Steve and I and the other dorks of academics, the
I
dorks
wasn't
of
going to be the first to
academics.
say it.
Yeah. But systems thinking is accessible to all peoples. If you describe a system with closed loops, right, where everything interacts and you get your emergent behavior. And I realize each module of my national model is a lot of words, and I realized that's how I'm going to close the book and give the alternative solution. So I spent 35,000 words critiquing what I don't like about economics, and now I'm going to do, I don't know, maybe another 20,000 showing, well, this is how a systems thinker would approach these problems. And the great part about systems thinking is it is first principles. You are looking at the structure of a system and how it interacts, and you see the emergent behaviors. So that's my writing style. And I wanted to know, Steve, what's your writing style behind the scenes? And Dave, same with you. How do you tell a cohesive story? I'm interested in that because that's where I'm at right now, kind of formulating this book. Either one of you
Okay.
can go first.
Go, Steve.
Okay. I've in some ways, if I get the first sentence, I finish the book. So to me, it's getting an opening that lets me then tell a narrative on the other side. But to tell the narrative, I've got to have the entire concept in my head to begin with. So in this, you and I both systems thinkers. We build cohesive models which are self-referential and all the dynamics is contained in the system. And once we've got that, it's a question of how do you communicate to somebody else? So that's really getting the first sentence is what I lead in with. And this, I think, reflects the fact that the main thing I would have learned at school, I would say, is how to debate, because I love debating. And I joined the debating team in my first year of high school and did it all the way through high school and then at university as well. And I just love the fact that you had to make a debate. And in a debate, you had to persuade an audience. And it was often, how do I get them, engage them? And if you don't engage them from the first sentence, you're in trouble. Okay. So it came down to this first sentence that gets the audience attention. And then I roll from that. And I've got to do the back work to be able to do it. But if I don't have a good first sentence, I can't write the book. So I'll give you the first sentence for my next book, which is how capitalists are going to how economists will destroy capitalism. That's the working title. Of course, it's on the madness of neoclassical economists over climate change. But the opening sentence is don't overrate sincerity.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's good.
Okay, and it leads on, a voice boomed from the back of the room. The most sincere person you'll ever meet will be the maniac chasing you down the street with an axe, trying to chop your head off. And they'll read the first paragraph. The room is a classroom in a Catholic boys' school in Sydney in 1969, and the voice belonged to our religion teacher, Brother Gerard. Unlike most of his friars, Gerard did not shove a catechism down our throats, but let us engage in ethical and political discussions which were shared not by him, but by the students. And that's my framework to bringing in the danger of somebody who sincerely believes something which is false. And people often use I quote the Upton, what's his name, Upton Sinclair, saying that, it's very hard to get somebody to appreciate something when their income depends upon them not understanding it. But I say, that's somebody you're paying to say something they don't believe. You can't pay somebody who doesn't believe something to fly a plane into a building. You can get somebody who believes something to fly a plane into a building. So belief is more dangerous than self-interest.
Very good. I feel like my points are now going to be very lightweight compared to that. But no, I actually know the first line thing, Steve, is really powerful. There's certainly, I'd find it a struggle to start with that, although I can see why it'd be inspiring. There's my favorite all-time first line in any book ever is actually not one of the classics, like it was the best times, worst times stuff. It's an Ian Banks novel, Crow Road.
Okay. Yeah.
And the opening line is the first time I met Verity Walker was the day my grandmother exploded. And he goes on to explain that it's totally legit as it's not some device. It's like, oh yeah, that is technically what happened. It's brilliant, and you have to keep reading. And so that was my favorite of all time. But Ty, my breakthrough, as it were, because I mean, I see myself as for many years, I just saw myself as a failed writer, and I think that's a good way of looking at it. I was a failed writer. Oh, I wrote a book. It was just easier to see myself that way, so it took the pressure off. But I did get a very, very long, boring book written. It was a stupid number of words. It was well over 100,000 words, and it was boring me. And I tried to explain everything so cleverly that it just disappeared up its own arse. But all the data was technically there. But why would you read it? And the breakthrough for me was I realized that the person I wanted to convince was an actual person that I knew of these ideas, and I wanted to talk as a mate of mine, and he had totally opposing ideas to me, and I wanted to talk to him in a way that was friendly and accessible, and just get these ideas down in a way that I could say, look, here is what I believe, and it wouldn't be this heated debate. It would just be like, I've laid out as carefully as I could what that is. And it matters because what happens when you do that, and I have heard of other writers doing this, is your point of view becomes so singular that you actually pull in people who it's not aimed at, because they just can see the point of view very clearly. So I found that really useful device. And most of my articles I write now, which are also helping me write a new book, are about trying to find that person that I'm talking to directly and trying to convince them of my argument. And then to try to remember that you need to not be a dick, about it, so that you can get the point across. Maybe anger is a device sometimes, but for the most part, you want to be convincing, so you want to be nice about it, and friendly. So that's the way I got a bit of a breakthrough to finish writing the book. And then it came together really, really quick, because I got so brutal with it. I was just like, that's boring, doesn't matter, irrelevant. This is important. Rewrite this, and suddenly Sam Mendes talked about the film American Beauty. They edited it, and it was boring, and then suddenly it shed its skin. He said it just shed its skin and revealed itself in its new form, and suddenly it was interesting to me, and that's really all I cared about. I was like, this is a book I want to see out in the world. That's good enough for me for a first book.
Dave, was there any, okay, well, this is kind of relative to my story. I found my writing has gotten better now that I write from my own personal story and perspective in life. So as before, my biggest struggle, and this comes around obsessive compulsive disorder. I'm not diagnosed or anything like that, but I'm pretty obsessive about being an authority on things, getting the facts right, measuring up to my peers like Steve Keen. And that was a huge block for me. And this is over the last 6 months, I realized people, and I've put it out there in blogs. For instance, when I told my own story about coming up, running a trucking company, people are really interested in a person's personal story and then how it relates to the topic. Could you find any of that in your own writing process, that there was a change where you looked at other authors, and then you realize, no, I'm the author here. This is my story. And it may sound like a little bit of narcissism, but it's not. It's about telling through your lens, your words, your feelings. Was there any of that for you in writing the book?
Yeah, I think as long as that doesn't become indulgent, it's really important. In fact, but the flip side is that audiences want that. That's well known. So audiences that are fiction and non-fiction want to know. Oh, sorry, if it's fiction, then it's going to be somebody's story, but it's a fictional one. But so they want the interpersonal, and that's why fiction works. But in the non-fiction world, I think there's not enough emphasis on the fact that the writer, people want to know about that person. It's why Bill Bryson wrote a book about scientists, their lives, because he found that the scientists were almost often more interesting than their work. Darwin's bit of a nutcase, really, but he's brilliant. So it just made it very interesting. So I think revealing your own thinking and your own anecdotes and how you get there, yes, I think it's really important, because it helps people trust that what you're doing is in good faith, for a start, and secondly, because people want to know about other people. Simple as that.
Right. And Steve, I see it in some of your books as well, how you document your history from, being that rebel in university, doing the activism and stuff like that. In your writing process, once you started writing full books, how big of a factor was your own personal experience when you do write a book? How does that play in for you? When did you realize that, because you're a pro at this, you got a PhD, you're well educated, right? You know how to write. When was it a realization that an important part of writing a piece, even if it's academic, involves your own personal lens, your own personal experiences? How did that factor in for you?
That came in late, because I don't come from an academic family, and I think this is a major reason why I took a long time to become an academic, and also to realize that I had something to contribute, because I was the very first person in my extended family to ever go to university, and I didn't come first at school. A lot of people think I would have been ducks at the school. No, I wasn't. Best I ever came was second. And therefore, in my own personal evaluation of myself, I remember thinking, well, I'm second in the class. And this is, I'm going to go to university, but I'm going to be middle of the road because I only came second here, and there must be brighter people at me than other schools, all the Duxes and so on. I end up being the dominant person in economics at Sydney University in 1973, but what the hell's going on here? Why me? And it turned out the guy who beat me in my class became chief chip designer for Motorola. His name's Jim Prendergast, lovely bloke. I've lost touch with him, but he's a lovely human being. And so here I'm comparing myself to somebody thinking I'm going to be ordinary, and he becomes chief chip designer for Motorola. That's how exceptional my class was. So I didn't realize how I'd been ranked out overall, and I've ultimately found I've had I used to describe myself when I went back to university. The reason for going back was I wanted to communicate other people's ideas about economics that I learned by doing all the research and reading books while I was at university and reading other contrary works afterwards. I wanted to communicate that well to other people. I didn't think I'd do original research. So my first shock was when I started doing original things, which is in writing my critique of Marx. And therefore, I found myself instantly in the role of contrarian, because most people who read Marx read the labor theory of value and they become zealots for socialism. And I did not accept a priori that the labor theory of value was correct. I remember saying to a colleague when we were going to a Marx reading group, I wanted very good proof from Marx as to why machines don't add value. Well, I read it with a critical eye, and I found a logical error in Marx. He came up with an absolutely brilliant philosophical foundation in terms of a dialectic between use value and exchange value. He used that to derive labor being a source of value, but he then contradicted it when it came to machinery. And so my role was saying, there's a contradiction here. Other people can't see it. How can I communicate it to other people? So that became more than my personal story. It became finding somebody who'd done a brilliant innovation, but then also made a huge logical error with something else. And how did that happen? So my personal story really didn't turn up until I kept on doing it time and time and time again. And then partly the question becomes, why am I an iconoclast? What the hell's about my personality that leads to me undermining logical errors in schools of thought that other people accept? And so that then my personal story turns up in that sense, because I realized in that sense, I'm never going to say I'm on the intellectual level of Max Planck or Galileo, but I do what both those did. I live in a paradigm and I see the paradigm as an error, and then I attack the paradigm. And to do that, there's got to be something about my personality or my biology that means that fear doesn't restrict my behavior. So I've seen so many people afraid to step outside what the accepted wisdom is. They won't say anything, or they'll go along with something and they'll persuade themselves ultimately that this contradictory set of thoughts can be made consistent. And that's just never been me. And I wonder whether it comes back to, we know the part of the brain that generates fear responses. I think it's called the amygdala. And you can have varying levels of fear response out of your exposure to different events. I clearly have very little fear in contradicting my peer group, whereas most people are afraid of contradicting their peers. And if they find themselves heading in that direction, they turn around. So, I'm not saying in that sense my personal story isn't important in terms of what I did as writing. It's really finding logical flaws. But there's got to be something weird about me where I spot those logical flaws and I don't shut up.
It's same with me. You need therapy, and that's okay.
I think therapy, yeah.
Therapy is
Welcome
okay.
to Misfits
Either that or
Therapy,
maple
the
syrup,
new
I can't
channel
work
for
out.
economists.
Have you been broken by a marginal analysis and equilibrium theory?
That's brilliant.
We can help.
Yeah, okay.
But Steve, you've also, in my observation of you over time, is you've also, to contradict your own peer group is challenging for anyone, but you've also been able to look at your own thinking and then gone, you know what, I'm just going to update this and explain why. And that doesn't happen nearly enough, and probably because of nearly the same reasons. It's terrifying. So yeah, maybe your amygdala is really small or something. Maybe we need to scan your brain, find out what's going on there, and then borrow it and inject it into people randomly, especially neoclassical economists. That's my
I'd love to.
thinking.
That's fun. Yeah, okay, good. Me as a virus. That sounds particularly useful.
The Keen virus.
Actually, I'll bring up I haven't actually done a lot with this old cartoon book of mine, but I'll bring it up and show the back cover. So chat away, and I'll find the cartoon cover.
So Dave, I'll carry on before we move to the Charlie Kirk topic.
Oh gosh, yeah.
Does literary works still have a place in our world compared to, let's say, the early part of the 20th century? So we live in a world where we have so many different types of media available to us, whether it's, all our personal blogs, our YouTube channels, right? Our social media opinions. Has that degraded, or has it changed the way we can get our intellectual ideas along? And has that pushed the idea of novel works to the side? Or is there a possibility that the works that are still being created to this day in 100 years will look back and say, wow, that was historic for society? Much like, so if we keep it in economics, we can say the general theory by John Maynard Keynes, we look back at that's an historical piece in economics. Are we still going to have that 100 years from now, where we look back on the books being written today and say, that was really influential? Or are we getting drowned out by all the different mediums that are out there now?
Sure.
Will that drown out what's the published works that are coming out now?
What'll still exist, if it's not the book in the obvious sense, what'll still exist is the thinking that's the blueprint that might have been the book somewhere first, and then it got turned into other mediums. Because what the book does for anybody, and this is why I don't believe that, like, AI on its own, for example, is a threat to writing. It's a threat to crap writing or average writers. But what it does is it might help you with your process, and that's great. I use it for that. I use it for pattern recognition, all sorts of things, and of course, to help with researchers actually finding source material and papers and things like that. But what you find is that the writing process still helps you shape your thinking, right? So the book isn't even for an audience in the first place. It's for you to clarify your own thinking and to therefore come up with being clear about your thinking so that you can articulate it later on in other formats. So even if people start going straight to I'm making a video about it, for instance, which is already happening, that medium has come from writing first. So I think of myself as a writer, and then I go and make videos. I do blogs. I do podcasts with a mate from time to time. That kind of stuff all comes out of doing the writing first. So yeah, in 100 years, whatever we call that, it's still going to be going on. People will go into their solitary space in order to thrash out their thinking. There'll be maybe totally different subjects by then. Maybe we'll have actually solved the problem of loanable funds versus endogenous money, and people won't be arguing endlessly about it on podcasts.
Sorry, I just had an orgasm. Yeah.
I'm trying to get the channel monetized, Steve.
We'll be going to other things,
I'm trying to undermine you, mate. I've been a battle here.
And we'll be talking about totally different things. And we've lost Steve now, but that's fine. So yeah, that thinking has to go on in some process of writing behind the scenes, even in 100 years. So I don't think it's going to go away. But also I think the novel, even though the novel is quite a relatively new thing, I think Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness was considered the first true modern novel. And that's less than a couple hundred years ago. It's very much, that's a new thing, but that is not what we think of when we think of books and writing. So no, I reckon you'll still have books, even hard copy books in 100 years. But like we'll have vinyl in 100 years. That technology doesn't go away.
That's one little fun detail I can share. The book I wrote when I was down in Hungary, Rebuilding Economics from the Top Down, the Hungarian organization that was supposed to publish it collapsed. I've given up hearing anything back from them. So I've approached Vox Day, who's a good friend of mine on the right side of general politics, but he's a great fan of my approach to economics. He's going to publish it. But he has a special series, which is leather-bound books printed on parchment paper and sold to collectors. and that's what it's going to first come out as, a collector's item.
Cool.
So that book will. I've still got to. I've got to write a preface about my relationship with Vox, which is a lot of fun. The fact that he's politically and religiously very different to me, but we see eye to eye as iconoclasts, and he wants to make my book last indefinitely. So the idea of the goat skin and the parchment paper is it'll last hundreds, possibly thousands of years, whereas the stuff we use for normal paperbacks right now would be unreadable in about 150 years.
I completely forgot about that book. Being
Yeah.
wedged between your new Kindle publication and the new economics. I forgot all about that, and I forgot to even ask you, hey, where's that at? So
Yeah, I
it
know.
was
I've used it.
uh,
The Hungarians.
it
I've
was
written it several times. Yeah.
so it was wasn't it the Budapest University or
Budapest Center for Long-Term Sustainability,
yeah.
which paid me a very nice sum with the all I had to do was write a 130,000 word book and write two 5,000 word articles. So I wrote one 75,000 word book and two 6,000 word articles, and delivered on my side of the contract. And then they folded, and I had nothing for ages. And I felt suspicious when I left, because this is a beautiful building in the heart of Budapest, in what's called the castle district. Absolutely gorgeous building. I had a room which is about 80 square meters, all to myself. Beautiful artworks. There was a wine room. There was conference rooms. It was all set up pre-COVID. And guess what happened? COVID. So Richard Werner was there before me, and there was a Mexican guy who was into town and country planning who was there at the same time as me. But ultimately, when I left, there was me and one other Hungarian researcher I didn't even know was a researcher, and that was it. There were three clerical staff, there were lots of support staff, but three key clerical staff. Two of them disappeared at Christmas, never got replaced. And I'm thinking, this doesn't feel like it's going to continue for me. And sure enough, a couple of months after I left, I heard it had been shut down for financial irregularities. Okay? So the book has just disappeared in the middle. I waited for a while, and I then wrote, what's happening? No, nothing from the so-called publisher, nothing from the center. I got we'll get back to you from the central bank. They haven't got back to me. I thought, fuck it. I've got to, pardon me, there's got another $10 for you, Ty. I'll then have to publish it myself. So I approached Vox a couple of weeks ago, and what I now have to do is just get rid of the final chapter, because I trashed Richard Werner in the final chapter. That's no longer necessary. But I want to put a preface in about Vox Day and my relationship there, and you guys as well. So once I write that, it'll be into Vox, and then it'll come out as a limited edition, author signed, collector's item in hardcover, in leather bound, and then at some point it'll come out hardback, and then after that paperback.
And then drop one copy into that seed bank up in Norway, and that'll last 10,000 years too. That's just another way that we can get it out there for a long time, for the long term.
It's a great
next
idea.
Civilization that comes round, they'll pick up the first book will be heterodox economics, and finally we'll get it right.
Well, I'm also trying to simultaneously write a Rosetta Stone between humans and kangaroos, because in my opinion, once we wipe ourselves out, the next intelligent species, if any existing species will survive and replace us as the intelligent species, it has to be something with opposable thumbs. Okay, it has to be where they can stand on 2 feet, and kangaroos are perfect. So I'm going to try to get.
Have they got opposable thumbs?
I don't know, but that could evolve them. Okay, they've got
There's your missing.
You don't want to get too close to a kangaroo's claws, let me tell you. But they do effectively have hands they can use. So it'd be feasible at some stage, evolution, fighting over a piece of, sugar cane, perhaps. They'll learn how to get opposable thumbs. They'll evolve them.
The Planet of the Apes is now
Planet of the Kangaroos.
Yeah,
we need Planet of the Kangaroos. Okay, because apes, we're still sticking in simians. How racist is that?
Exactly.
Let's bring in some other species inside here. So the obvious candidates terrestrial are kangaroos. Okay.
Separate to this tangent, sorry, is quick sidebar. Is I know some comments there about your recent or blossoming bromance with Richard Murphy and the podcast.
That's been around for a long time. Yeah, we finally came out of the closet.
He finally did come out of the closet.
We were a fan of the old Maxwell Smart show.
Yeah, well,
Remember that
yes.
part?
I remember
I'll
that when I
tell
was
you
about 7. It's great.
my favorite episode of the whole thing had this is back set in the 50s or the early 60s, so it's black and white, and there's a man in a business suit and a woman very well dressed, and they're both looking around furtively, and the man's walking along, and he jumps into a closet, literally a closet in the wall, and then the woman does the same thing, and she jumps in, and they're passionately kissing, and finally she says, "Oh, Jack, we've got to stop meeting like this." And he said, "Why?" And he said, "Well, for one thing, I don't particularly like you."
And this is meant to be a metaphor of you and Richard Murphy. I mean,
The thing is, they've been together for ages.
Therapy.
Therapy,
Need
therapy. Yeah,
therapy.
so like they were in the closet, you see,
I'm
and
getting
they
very
came out of
worried
the
there.
closet. But Rich and I've been mates to a decade or so, and this is our
Yeah.
first time of making it obvious.
Very
You
good.
know,
Yeah, no,
that's
I was listening in as well.
yeah, no, I was excited to see that. I didn't know about Richard Murphy until about 2 years ago. It happened to be a pile-on situation with the MMTers because he said something wrong.
Hmm.
And I was offended by it because I'm thinking, wow, you've got this guy that is hugely popular in the UK. His blog is hugely successful, and he's generally an advocate for MMT. And because he had a slight disagreement, you guys are piling on. So I got involved, and he mentioned me in one of his blogs, and I was honored. This is, he's got his blog's pretty popular.
Yeah, it is.
Thou
And
shalt not
and,
venture from the talking points of MMT,
yeah,
apparently.
so I reached out to him and we got him on the live stream about 2 years ago, and then he came back again. I think last year you were around for that one, Dave.
Yeah.
And he's a really smart guy. So I was really happy to see. I think that's a really good combination. I hope you guys do a few here and there. Don't do too many because then I'm gonna feel like chopped liver because we got something going on here. I know he's famous, Steve. But come
Mm.
on.
You got
He's
to get you
British.
boosted.
He's yeah, exactly. So,
Yeah.
but anyways, I think it is actually a good combination. So I look forward to a little bit more of that. And so that kind of brings us to the end of the show. And I'll bring it up, Tony. And especially when somebody says no, don't do it, I'm gonna fucking do it. And I'll fuck the monetization, right? So Charlie Kirk, everybody's seen it. I don't have to describe the situation. One thing I want to reiterate is I think about the 1960s. Now, I wasn't alive for Kennedy. I wasn't alive for his brother getting shot. Martin Luther King, I wasn't alive for that, but I got to read the narrative of that era in US politics.
Mm.
And it feels like what I'm witnessing now down in the United States is kind of similar. And there seems to be a path out because history shows it, at least into a path of better political stability. And one thing I just want to say about it is no matter what side you're on, we can't resort to political violence to that degree. It doesn't matter what your opinions are. That is obviously not a healthy way to proceed forward in democracy. And I was kind of horrified. I saw the video. I feel for his family. I don't agree with it. Okay. Charlie Kirk was a bigot. He was a racist and he incited hate. But nobody deserves to die that way in a public manner and have their family see that. And so I put out a blog, and I was very. I don't care about Charlie Kirk, but I am very sad to see that I'm living in a time where maybe we are hitting a paradigm shift in our politics in democracies where it might not be good for a while. And that part brings me sadness because I still got a great deal of my life left, and it's not going to be as good as the American prax, which is kind of like the Roman prax, where you thought that perfect Western world was going to go on forever, and what I'm seeing today is certainly not an indication of that. What I saw over the past week with that specific situation, it really highlights that for me, and that's the part that brings me sadness. And I also don't like the rhetoric that I'm seeing out of the left, and I don't like the rhetoric that I'm seeing out of the right on this specific topic. I think it's so incredibly unhealthy that it's come down to political divide where we compare people to Nazis, and he was not a Nazi. He just had really terrible, insensitive views. But he wasn't Hitler. And it's the same with the right. There's not a bunch of woke leftists running around killing people. That's the worst rhetoric. I saw this short on YouTube, and it compared Joe Biden's speech about Donald Trump's attempted assassination and Donald Trump's speech on Charlie Kirk's assassination, and the polar opposite. And just whatever you think about Joe Biden, if he was old and senile, or maybe he was a neoliberal too, there is still a path forward where tragedies like this should bring us together as nations, not push us further apart. And that's my feeling on the whole situation in its entirety. Dave and Steve, I don't know if you have any more you could add on. Maybe not directly about Charlie Kirk if you don't want to talk about him, but definitely the political divide we're seeing. And Steve, because you grew up in that era, you saw the 60s and you experienced that, you probably have some good opinions to kind of compare where we are now and the 1960s, let's say.
Oh, look, it's very hard to say, because what I've realized is, and this is something which actually comes out of thinking in terms of complex systems, it's very hard to have a big man theory of history when you know the statistical weight of reality. But then you see events in history and think, what if that event hadn't happened? And for example, with the assassination of Kennedy, JFK, he looked like he would have pulled America out of Vietnam. And he was also trying to have conciliatory moves towards Cuba. The Cuban Missile Crisis was solved by Robert Kennedy agreeing tacitly, without advertising it, with Nikita Khrushchev, I think it was at the time, to pull American missiles out of Turkey, in response for which the Russians pulled their missiles out of Cuba. So that ended the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now
the documentary with sorry to interrupt, Steve, the McNamara. There's a documentary just before he died. He did, and he revealed a lot of that stuff. Oh my God, it's terrifying.
Yeah. So what it means is, if there hadn't been the assassination of Kennedy, we might not have Cuba might have been reconciled, and we might not have had the Vietnam War. So one person, one assassination, and that level of change. And then there are arguments about the role of Israel as well, and that I don't know that enough to say anything, but to know that I've seen it. So you can see that and this is where, when you learn complex systems, you realize the law of big numbers isn't everything. There are complex systems where a tiny bifurcation can lead to a dramatic difference in the outcome of the world. And so 9/11 was one of those. And hanging Chads in Florida. If it hadn't been for that, we wouldn't have had George W. as president. We would have had Al Gore. Now, that would have meant potentially we might not have had 9/11. We certainly wouldn't have targeted Afghanistan and Iraq after 9/11, because we know it's Saudi Arabia that's involved in that, not those states. So there's the incredible sensitivity to tiny events, relatively speaking, can feed through the whole system. So I don't know what's going to happen after Charlie Kirk, okay? But it could be one of those events that leads to outright political conflict in America. It could be something which is irrelevant. You never really know. And that's the fear that I have when this sort of thing happens. A system can bifurcate on a dime, and this could be a dime.
So what I'd add to that, though, is at least some context and perspective is, even though, Steve, you're right, there are trigger events, of course, in history, it is worth remembering that there's no monopoly on the stuff. It's being seen as like a look at those lefties or whatever is being said.
The right.
It turns out, it sounds like he's not. Yeah. It sounds like he's a conservative, the guy that shot him. I don't know for sure, but that's
maybe a bit. I mean, it might be the John Lennon case, a nutcase.
Nutcase, exactly.
Yeah.
In which case, it's irrelevant, isn't it?
I did wonder whether it was an Israeli false flag. That was my first thought about it. There seemed to be stuff pointing in that direction.
That's the fevered sorts of things, of course, that are kicking around because people are geared to think that could be happening. I know, but to think that anyway because it's so fevered. But let's some context. There's just over probably a couple of months ago now, 2 months, I think, Melissa Hortman and her husband were murdered by someone posing as a police officer in Minnesota, right? And she's a congresswoman or a senator? Congresswoman. So, Democrat. So there's no monopoly on this violence on either side, and I think that's what,
particularly in America. Yeah.
But she's forgotten. Like it's only 2 months ago that political violence didn't suddenly get invented today, in the same way that it didn't get invented, say, on 7th of October in Israel either. These are getting us. I'm going to sound like Billy Joel. We didn't start the fire, but but tackling it at the level of event like this and going, oh look, this new is, I think, part of the problem where we get these ideas that I think commenting on it is hard for me because it feels like the turkey the what do they call it, the vegetarian should get spared the knife that's for the turkey or something. This butchered that, excuse the pun, saying, but the idea that anybody that's after some sort of system change where you build in some de-escalation to things is then asked to comment on what to do about these terrible things. Like, well, the thing that people like me have been saying for a long time, which is we can't have this kind of politics, we can't have these kinds of systems because they include escalation in them because of the power struggles. I think that's what's frustrating, and that's why I don't comment on it, because like, look, the best thing that anyone I think can do is advocate to changes to systems rather than comment on the things themselves or the events themselves and who's to blame, because I think it's all window dressing, which is a bit. I tell you what, though, it is good to go back and watch Oliver Stone's JFK periodically, whether he's right or not. It's some great insights into these sorts of big events and the sorts of things that people that take advantage of them, whether or not they commit them in the first place, people do take advantage of those events once they happen. And I think that's what's probably going on right now.
Yeah.
Certainly that's a good final word. I think it was, I think that's the type of mature conversation that needs to be had at a higher level, with politicians right now, is kind of what we're saying right now. To kind of like we said, we are in that complex system, and the only levers we have in that complex system is to kind of deleverage the rhetoric a little bit, and hopefully we can do that. I'll talk about this more on Sunday. It's been a great show. I'm glad I got to do the brutal ass takedown of Steve Keen today. It was incredible. People will be talking about it for the ages. And hopefully historians will write books about it.
Let's hope so. Yeah.
Tyson Jake Paul, it wasn't.
Anyways, I'll be back on Sunday. Dave and Steve, they'll be back on Friday, and we'll do this all over again. I'm sure a bunch of other stuff will happen, and we'll cover it. Till then, bye-bye.
You are now relearning economics.